Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com discussing the decline and fall of the magazine Scientific American. Scientific American tweeted this yesterday. They've agreed with major news outlets worldwide to start using the term climate emergency in its coverage of climate change. In other words, they've agreed to collude with news agencies to push an agenda. They're behaving as propagandists rather than as an impartial scientific magazine. Also yesterday, this video came out from Project Veritas. The video showed CNN's technical director talking about how they were going to be hammering climate change nonstop for years. Our next thing is going to be climate change awareness. He said that they beat the pandemic story to death, but the climate story's got longevity. Climate thing is going to take years, so they'll probably be able to milk that for quite a bit. He also said that their focus last year was to overthrow the President of the United States. And Scientific American also participated in that coup against the president. October 1st, 2020, Scientific American endorses Joe Biden. We've never backed a presidential candidate in our 175-year history until now. Now I'm going to show you how Scientific American has degenerated from a scientific journal into a propaganda rag. 100 years ago, they ran an article showing the benefits of increased carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere. By increasing CO2 levels around plants, they were able to produce crop yields which were much higher than ambient air. The article was titled Carbonic Acid Gas to Fertilize the Air. What they did was they took CO2 emissions from smokestacks, scrubbed out the pollutants, and used it to fertilize their fields. And here's the text: fertilizing the air with carbon dioxide to promote plant growth. One of the principal constituents making up the body of a plant is carbon, representing about 1/2 of its organic substance. The opinion that this carbon is derived from the soil has long been abandoned. Modern investigation having shown atmospheric carbonic acid to be absorbed by means of the chlorophyll or green matter of the leaves and decomposed into its elements, the carbon in conjunction with the root sap and atmospheric moisture being worked into organic compounds. Whereas atmospheric air at present is relatively poor in carbonic acid, of which it contains only about 0.03%. At an early period in the development of our planet, when this was covered with the luxuriant forests our coal deposits are derived from, it comprised incomparably greater quantities of this gas. This fact suggested the idea of heightening the fertility of the soil by increasing its carbonic acid content, and thus producing conditions resembling those of antediluvian ages. So Scientific American is known for over 100 years that increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are extremely good for life. And they've also known that life thrived on Earth at incomparably greater quantities of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The increase in carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere over the last 40 years has been shown by NASA satellites to be making Earth much greener. Not surprisingly, this is helping crop yields skyrocket. Corn yields in the United States since 1940 are up 500%. And it's the same story in Europe and just about every place else in the world. Crop yields are way up as carbon dioxide levels have increased. So let's look at what Scientific American has to say about this topic now. They say, ask the experts. Does rising CO2 benefit plants? Climate change's negative effects on plants will likely outweigh any gains from elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So what Scientific American did was they ignored the evidence of increasing crop yields over the last 80 years and instead are relying on speculation from people they call experts. The article went on, climate change's negative effects on plants will likely outweigh any gains from elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Many skeptics also fail to mention the potentially most harmful outcome of rising atmospheric CO2 on vegetation, climate change itself. Its negative consequences, such as drought and heat stress, would likely overwhelm any direct benefits that rising CO2 might offer plant life. But 100 years ago, Scientific American knew that plant life did extremely well on Earth at incomparably greater quantities of CO2. 100 years ago, Scientific American did actual science, but now they're just a propaganda outlet. They're ignoring 100 years of empirical evidence. In fact, it's much worse than that. They're actually ignoring more than 500 million years of evidence. The greatest expansion of life on Earth occurred 540 million years ago when CO2 was right at its peak of 7,000 parts per million, which is 15 times higher than it is now. As Scientific American reported in their 1920 article, our coal beds are derived from luxuriant forests which grew at a time when CO2 levels in the atmosphere were much higher. This article in Scientific American is based on unscientific speculation and hearsay, and they've ignored all the empirical evidence. Now let's look at some of their other climate propaganda. Earth is on fire. They're trying to say that increased levels of CO2 are burning up the planet. But 100 years ago, they knew that Earth had luxuriant forests at incomparably higher levels of CO2. Once again, Scientific American is engaged in propaganda and ignoring 540 million years of empirical evidence. Here's some more of their propaganda. We broke the atmosphere. But 100 years ago, they knew that increased CO2 levels were good for the planet, good for the atmosphere, and good for human beings. This is shameless propaganda from Scientific American and has nothing to do with science. We don't have to guess what Earth would be like at higher CO2 levels because we have 540 million years of evidence to show us that life has done extremely well when CO2 levels were higher. Now let's look at some of their propaganda from 9 years ago. They said most models predict that Arctic sea ice will disappear by 2030 or 2040. But Peter Wadhams, who leads the Polar Ocean Physics Group at the University of Cambridge, has predicted since 2008 that the Arctic ice would be gone by 2015. Now he believes there's a chance it could happen even sooner. Once again, Scientific American is relying on models and speculation from people who clearly don't know what they're talking about. Arctic sea ice extent is almost identical to what it was 10 years ago in 2011. Extent is also higher than it was 15 years ago in 2006. It's higher than 2007, 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, and last year. Doing a simple regression of the trend over the past 15 years, the Arctic won't be ice-free for 270 years. And based on the summer minimum, the Arctic won't be ice-free for 214 years. Arctic sea ice volume is currently higher than it was 4 years ago, and the average thickness is about 2 meters, which is the same thickness it was in 1958. New York Times, October 19, 1958. The changing face of the Arctic. Some scientists estimate that the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half century ago, and that even within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic Ocean may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole. Although the idea that a solid ice sheet covers the central Arctic has lingered stubbornly in the popular fancy, the northern cap of ice worn by our planet is actually a thin crust, on the whole only about 7 feet or 2 meters thick. The superstition that ice in the Arctic used to be much thicker has been around for a very long time. And much of academic climate science is based around superstition. In 2008, Norway's leading Arctic expert predicted that the Arctic would be ice-free that summer. National Geographic reported that Canada's leading expert, David Barber, predicted the North Pole would be ice-free in 2008. Mark Cerise at the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado, predicted the same thing, an ice-free North Pole in 2008. Based on these ridiculous predictions from academics, British swimmer Lewis Pugh tried to kayak to the North Pole from Svalbard. He only made it about 20 kilometers. NASA's leading Arctic expert, Jay Zwally, predicted the Arctic would be ice-free by the year 2012, and Mark Cerise said, "The Arctic is screaming." National Geographic predicted that the Arctic would be ice-free by 2012. The BBC was a little more conservative and predicted that the Arctic wouldn't be ice-free until 2013. Nobel Prize winner Al Gore was even more conservative. He said the Arctic wouldn't be ice-free until 2014. NASA's leading climate expert James Hansen started the global warming scare before Congress in 1988. He said the Arctic would be ice-free between 2013 and 2018. Congressional Democrats said that he was correct and that he was a climate prophet. The Sierra Club predicted the Arctic would be ice-free by 2013. Cambridge University predicted that the Arctic would be ice-free by 2015. Journalist Mark Hartsgaard also predicted the Arctic would be ice-free by 2015 and would be the end of polar bears. And the most ridiculous prediction of all came from President Obama's science advisor John Holdren. He predicted that the Arctic would become ice-free during winter. This is a pretty incredible concept considering that the sun doesn't shine at the North Pole for 6 months of the year. It appears that Scientific American and many of their friends don't understand the basic principles of science. Now let's look at how Scientific American is attempting to rewrite history. How the global cooling story came to be. 9 paragraphs written for Newsweek in 1975 continue to trump 40 years of climate science. It's a record that has its author amazed. I could write an entire encyclopedia on the global cooling scare, but let's just look at a few of the stories. 60 years ago, the New York Times reported on a unanimous consensus that Earth was cooling. 50 years ago, the Washington Post reported, colder winters herald dawn of new ice age. Scientists see ice age in the future. Washington Post, July 9, 1971. U.S. scientists sees new ice age coming. The world could be as little as 50 or 60 years away from a disastrous new ice age, a leading atmospheric scientist predicts. Dr. S.I. Rasool of NASA and Columbia University says that. So 50 years from 1971 would be now. And looking out the window at all the snow falling on my daffodils, he might have been correct. New York Times, July 18, 1970. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. In 1972, 42 top American and European investigators gathered at Brown University under the auspices of the National Science Foundation. They were so worried about a new ice age that they wrote a letter to President Nixon warning of a new ice age in about a century. The October 1974 edition of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's magazine warned about the dangers of ongoing cooling which have been occurring since the 1940s. They said that pack ice and waters around Iceland and Greenland was becoming the hazard to navigation it was during the 17th and 18th centuries. There were tens of thousands of newspaper articles talking about global cooling during the 1970s and early 1980s. Here's a few of them. Armadillos moving southward. Earth is cooling. Return of ice age feared. Frequently freakish weather. The National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado published this graph in 1974, showing that Earth was cooler in 1970 than it was in 1870 and had been cooling very quickly since the 1940s. The March 1, 1975 edition of Science News showed glaciers plowing through Manhattan and was titled The Ice Age Cometh. In 1975, the National Academy of Sciences published this graph showing that temperatures had been plummeting since the 1940s. Time magazine said, another ice age. Telltale signs are everywhere, from the unexpected persistence and thickness of pack ice in the waters around Iceland to the southward migration of a warmth-loving creature like the armadillo. The Chicago Tribune said, brr, new ice age on way soon. Many climatologists see these signs as evidence. The Guardian, space satellites show new ice age coming fast. The director and most famous scientists from the National Center for Atmospheric Research were big proponents of global cooling in the coming ice age. Stephen Schneider was frustrated that President Nixon wouldn't listen to his warnings about global cooling. The CIA issued a report warning how global cooling threatened world stability. In 1978, the New York Times reported, international team of specialists finds no end in sight to 30-year cooling trend in Northern Hemisphere. And in the article they mentioned that there's not enough thermometer data available from the Southern Hemisphere to make a determination. 40 years ago, the Chicago Tribune reported, climatologists now blame recurring droughts and floods on a global cooling trend that could trigger massive tragedies for mankind. Now let's go back and look at the Scientific American story. They say that global cooling was strictly 9 paragraphs in an article from Newsweek. This is just straight up fraud by Scientific American. They're trying to deceive their readers. Here's the article they're referring to. Newsweek, April 28, 1975. Climatologists were so worried about global cooling that they wanted to melt the Arctic by covering the ice cap with soot. This was a dangerous geoengineering idea which was being promoted in 1975. I'm not going to cover it in this video, but Scientific American is once again promoting a very dangerous geoengineering idea from Bill Gates. He wants to pollute the upper atmosphere to reduce global warming. Now let's look at another very big lie from Scientific American. They claim that Christopher Columbus caused the Little Ice Age in 1492 by infecting Native Americans with smallpox and enslaving Africans. They said, mass deaths in America start new CO2 epoch. The atmosphere recorded the mass death, slavery, and war that followed 1492, the death by smallpox and warfare of an estimated 50 million Native Americans, as well as the enslavement of Africans. To work in the newly depopulated Americas allowed forests to grow on former farmlands. By 1610, the growth of all those trees had sucked enough carbon dioxide out of the sky to cause a drop of at least 7 parts per million in the atmosphere. This article is baseless, non-scientific nonsense, as I'm about to show you. According to the 1990 UN IPCC report, the cooling began around the year 1200, almost 300 years before Columbus came to America. And most of the cooling had already occurred by the time Columbus arrived. They showed more than 1 degree Celsius cooling from 1200 until 1650. Scientific American is trying to claim that a 7 part per million drop in CO2 caused more than 1 degree Celsius cooling. That's an utterly ridiculous claim about climate sensitivity, which is orders of magnitude out of range of the scientific literature. And according to the New York Times, 30 years ago, the Little Ice Age began around 1450, which was long before Columbus came to America. Scientific American is reporting junk science, which is based on politics rather than any actual facts. And Scientific American's lack of understanding of science goes well beyond climate. Here's an article they wrote on September 15, 2020, how New Mexico controlled the spread of COVID-19. The state went after the disease with widespread testing and science-based targets. Now it's in better shape than its neighbors. And then immediately after Scientific American published this article, cases started skyrocketing in New Mexico. New Mexico has been a complete disaster area for COVID-19. I haven't been able to visit my father there for over a year because of the restrictions issued by their governor. And this is what Scientific American calls science. A much better name for them at this point would be Unscientific Unamerican. I grew up with Scientific American on the dining room table and used to have a lot of respect for that magazine, but that's completely vaporized now. They've thrown out any pretense of doing science and become just one more in a long list of propaganda rags. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this sort of insanity for the past 13 years. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.